Sure. He and his wife, Deanne, have 3 children. It's a great honor to have him here in San Antonio. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Mark Regnerus.
Thanks. Thank you for having me, for the invitation. It's good to be here. I'm going to talk today about it's a little bit of an extension of this in some ways. This is, the task of Humanum was to lead with the beautiful, right? Unfortunately, I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty and the more grittier aspects of reality, right? So what I'm going to say is not as beautiful as what you just saw, but it is of the same piece, and behind it you see things that have to do with complementarity, right? The distinctiveness of men and women, different things that they want, the different sort of vulnerabilities and limitations they have, and how things work better when they are functioning together ideally, especially in marriage. So what I want to do today is segue a little bit from the beautiful into the real, right? So I kind of deal in realism, not because I don't have ideals. I do. And the ideals aren't threatened by realism, but the realism can sort of tell us how far we are away, in some ways, of where we want to go. So I'm a relatively new voice in the subject of marriage, men and women. It was less than 6 years ago that I floated my first op-ed piece where I talked about, I didn't think it was the worst idea in the world for men to marry before the average age of 29 and women before the average age of 27. It wasn't radical by any stretch, but the response was not warm, okay? But it was a good experience because it prepared me for even more sensitive stuff that has happened in the last several years. But today I'm going to pull back from the third rail, that is same-sex marriage, and we're going to talk about the other kind of marriage, the one my colleagues are less enthused about. Standard kind of male-female kind. In fact, I think the biggest threat to marriage is not the mixed signals that legalized same-sex marriage will send to young people. That should be resisted because it's not true. They're not real marriages. The biggest threat to marriage is the unraveling of what I see as sort of the complementary exchange model on which marriage has long been pragmatically built. That unraveling is having some significant intended and unintended consequences. So where do things stand today? Average age of marriage is rising, as I noted. The share of Americans in that 25 to 34-year-old kind of sweet spot for either being married or getting married, that share is shrinking about 1 percentage point a year, right? This goes from 2000, maps out to 2013. Starts out at 55% of that group were married in 2000. By 2013, that's down to 42% or 43%. Never married was 34, that's now up to 49%. 13 years. This is the slide that keeps me up at night. Many young people feel burned. There's paranoia about divorce and a great deal of experience in their families. Fickleness, temporariness of romantic relationships. One gets the overwhelming impression that the alienation between men and women may be at its historical zenith. I see a lot of distrust, holding back, failing to commit, leaving when it doesn't meet expectations. Marriage is precarious. We want it, but now we're in a situation where it has to be good. We have so much choice today, so many options, and hence we expect that this is going to be the case when we get married. But the reality is decidedly different. In the domain of sex, love, and marriage, we are fast moving into an era wherein only an elite minority of Americans, including Christians, will get married and have children in the order and the pace that they prefer. Sky is not falling yet, but Christians are finding themselves increasingly challenged to live the lives they want to, the lives they feel called to, the ones they assumed they could and would. Many have made the profound mistake of sacralizing what's going on, as if God were somehow responsible for this situation, as if it was by his doing, which is nonsense. If marriage is the normative state for Catholics, by which I simply mean the average or the expected, and I think it is, then we may have to be in the business of about making them happen. It is a social problem we have on our hands, not a collection of individuals' own personal problems, even though that is what we see day to day. Figuring out why marriage is stalling is a pretty important start. The answers do not lie in the will of God, as if somehow God prefers a rapidly diminishing marriage rate. No, we are better off looking at what modern human beings and contemporary social structures are up to. So I'm not going to talk about theology of the body this afternoon, though that is good stuff. Rather, I'm a social scientist. I look around about things in the social world, things like markets, collective expectations, threshold effects, things that clergy and counselors and youth ministers just don't see, or that's not their thing that they pay attention to. So I'm an unabashed realist. I want to operate in the world of what is going on. Realism doesn't establish the boundaries of my idealism. It just tells me where things are at. So when I study the relationships of young Americans, Catholic or otherwise, it is obvious to me that the premarital relationships and the rules about them clearly favor men, or at least a segment of men, and what they want in relationships. But marital relationships favor women and what they want, and men feel like they lose power in marriage. Both of these phenomena present challenges. So how does this work? First, to the premarital story, which is, I'll talk about that for longer because I've thought about it for longer, although I'm starting to pay more attention to how marriage works for men. So, why does the premarital experience, the marriage market, so to speak, why does that favor men or a significant share of men? Well, simply put, it's because women don't really need men anymore. At least not in the way they used to. Do they like men? Yes. They want men? Sure. But do they need men? Not like they used to. And that makes for a rather profound difference in how men and women relate romantically, sexually, and maritally today. Our contemporary sexual behavior patterns in the West, alarming as they are to many of us, are not simply the fault of popular culture gone bad or Hollywood, right? They don't help. But that's not where the key blame lies. I also don't think it's the simple function of bad catechesis. Right? We've got bad catechesis. But that's not to blame for this. Biblical illiteracy, men's failure to man up, that is not at fault. The story is about constraints. We overestimate how moral our grandparents were in their hearts, okay? Their choices were far more constrained than yours and mine are. Required their sacrifice. Marriage protected women economically. Men needed to offer that protection in order to access sex and children. For help. That's not the kind of world we live in anymore. It worked. Not always great, but it was functional. Okay? Remember that word functional, because we're going to revisit it a little bit later. This is not our world today. Not at all. It's not simply because people lack the will to be holy, A lot of people have the will to be holy. Okay? I'm going to talk about 3 forms of technology that have augmented our troubles. We have the pill. I'm not actually going to spend time talking about Catholic thought on contraception. Okay? I'm going to tell you about the world that has come to be not simply because it exists, but because it has been taken up at enough of a rate to create a mentality that sex is basically infertile until we choose for it to be otherwise. Because the pill in general functions to weaken the connection between sex and strong commitments. It really can't work otherwise, right? It has changed everything about the way people meet, fall in love, marry, or not. If pregnancy was a notable risk, Jane would just not sleep with Joe until she was convinced of his intentions and the relationship's security. No more. But that's just Jane and Joe at a personal level. What about the market? Over the years, the wide uptake of contraception doesn't have to be complete. It has to be enough to create a mentality. This wide uptake has functioned to split what was a relatively unified mating market. Okay? Blue, it looks like a pool, because that's what we think about it, as a pool. Wide uptake of contraception has functioned to split what was once this unified mating market in 2 quite distinctive components or corners. By relatively unified, I'm just saying that the majority of sex among unmarried people used to occur in and during the search for a mate, someone to marry. People seldom jumped into the sack quickly. For excess male sexual interest, which is as old as history, there was the market in prostitution, which is not this market. If it was up to men, that would probably be a valid industry. But since it posed a threat to women, they made sure it wasn't. And they succeeded for a very long time. The mating market, this large pool of single men and women looking for company of some sort, simply no longer functions in the same way as it did before the pill. In its place, we have this split mating market, one corner of which is largely for people pursuing sex, and one corner largely for people pursuing marriage. Since pregnancy can be easily prevented now, having sex and thinking about or committing to marry are 2 very different things today. Indeed, many young adults express no interest in marrying yet, or even getting serious. All that can wait, they believe, without penalty, they hold. But they have a strong interest in sex and romantic relationships short of marriage. This makes sense, since the age at which teenagers are becoming reproductively capable is becoming a little bit earlier, and the average age at which people marry is becoming later. This is a long, they call it maturity gap, is what they call it. That's a big gap. So the mating market split between those interested largely in sex and those interested in marriage is not complete. They're not 2 different pools. It is still one big pool of people. Men and women can and do dabble in different parts of that pool at the same time, sending mixed signals. Indeed, mixed signals are extremely common in the modern mating market. Right? We'll talk a little bit later about how discerning those signals has become rather difficult. It's prone to mistakes. The emergence of distinctive sex and marriage corners of this one mating market really doesn't need to cause a problem socially. If comparable numbers of men and women tended to flock to each corner, and if they preferred to stay in one of those corners, or if they drifted over and back at the same rates and times. None of those things is true. There are more men than women seeking sex, on average. There are more women than men seeking marriage, on average. So why all this talk about percentages ratios, half of this group, half of that group. After all, it only takes the providential meeting of one man and one woman to fall in love, right? That is true. But all of what I'm saying is also operating at the same time. So to speak economically, in an imbalanced sex ratio, more women than men, more men than women. These imbalanced sex ratio, especially when we talk about more women than men, lowers what economists would call the price of sex within a community. American women are more likely to marry when they are outnumbered by men in their local marriage market. It makes sense. If marriage markets were only subject to the influences of supply and demand, one would expect that the scarcer sex in a population would have the greater proportion married, because they can be pickier. That's not true, because when men are scarce, they're actually less likely to get married, because their market scarcity enhances their short-term mating success, decreases their incentives to commitment. When women are scarce, they're more likely to get married. We see this play out powerfully in the military. It's a military town. Women are scarce. In the African American community, men are scarce. In the first of those, we tend to see a lot more marrying going on. In the military, we still see some of the youngest average ages of marriage. In the African American community, we see very little marrying going on. The sex ratio matters a lot. I could still say that there's roughly the same number of men and women in the general big picture overall mating pool. The statement is almost meaningless today because the market really is split into two corners by the pill. As people get older, they tend to drift towards the marriage corner of the market. But given their distinctive biological clocks, they're drifting over at different times, different paces. One graduate student of mine talked about a story about a 31-year-old female friend of hers who was in a sexual and romantic relationship with a 38-year-old man. Her friend, my graduate student, was hoping that the two would get married soon, and so did the 31-year-old, right? She recently texted my graduate student to say that she had had a conversation with her boyfriend and that, quote, engagement is not around the corner. I was talking to the friend. I said, your friend should go on a sex strike. That's not going to happen, she said. No wonder women have so little authority to make relationships move forward. Sex is not costly enough, in this case, to Mr. 38-year-old. But she's put in a bind because she feels accurately like he may have more options than she does. We'll talk a little bit more about this. So there's more women than men in the marriage corner of the market, which unfortunately, as we just saw in this story, allows even marriage-minded men to be more selective, patient, picky, fickle, cautious, and for many of them insisting on sexual experience with marriage-minded women before committing. They're maximizing their rewards while paying limited costs. It continues to shock many devoutly Christian women to find that the men they're seeing actually expect to be sexually active within relationships and pretty quickly. To women, this comes across as confirming that men are plain immoral or afraid of commitment, or both. I'm not sure about the immoral thing, but I do know that men are not afraid of commitment at all. Indeed, some hold that women are more apt to be commitment incompatible when compared to men. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Women are far more likely to bail on marriage than men are. Are they commitment incompatible? The deal premaritally is that men are in the driver's seat in the marriage market because of this, and they can navigate it in the ways they wish to. Not with every particular woman, or any particular woman, but in general. However, I am starting to come to the conclusion that this pickiness, fickleness, applies to the most desirable half, maybe even 40% of men. Because women can be more selective than ever before. So they're ruling out large chunks of the male population as not marriageable, because they don't need to, right? And when you don't need to do something, the situation is different than when you do. And that top half, or that top 40% of men, have gotten used to this. Sex without commitment. Because what I call the cartel of women. Their pact to control the market value of sex has evaporated. Okay? Because contraception has rendered such a cartel unnecessary. After all, it was seldom men who policed women's relational interests. Women police women's relational interests. Men have always made bad sexual gatekeepers, except for their own family members. But in a brave new world where having sex no longer means having babies and marriage is becoming economically unnecessary, the solidarity that women once felt towards each other in the mating market has largely dissolved. Women no longer have each other's backs. On the contrary, now they see each other as competition. And when women compete for men, you can pretty much figure where that's going to go. So it shouldn't surprise any of us that the median age of first marriage in the United States is rising, and the share of Americans who are married, especially in that sweet spot, is continuing to drop. And the 1% a year is actually pretty significant, right? And you don't see it like tailing off, okay? I'm very curious, does that keep dropping at that rate? And yet many men still wish to marry, which is good. It's a very good sign. But the number of men that intend to marry is shrinking. It means that people in the mating market have to do a great deal of educated guesswork about the intentions and the seriousness of any particular person. And they're apt to guess incorrectly with a lot more regularity than ever before. It is a profoundly unsatisfying position to be in, especially for women on the front end, before marriage, but also maybe for men on the back end, inside marriage. It's why people use lots of signals and symbolic indicators to convey what they're actually looking for. This split was why people often feel deceived in their dating experiences. They thought so-and-so was more interested in a relationship than they turned out to be, or they were surprised that a guy moved so fast on the first date. Or later, he's surprised when her marital behavior did not comport to what he expected. As a result of all this, we actually have better marriages on average than we used to, but far fewer marriages than we used to, because people are far more apt to avoid or leave difficult marriages than ever before. We have a lot of singles, many of whom would like to be married, but the threshold for marrying has risen. Fertility has shrunk, but not radically so. Given what I just described, it's therefore no surprise that non-marital fertility is exploding, right? If fertility hasn't shrunk radically, but marriage rates have, that means your non-fertility rate is rapidly increasing. It's 41% of the population. I've described how this is a difficult scenario for women, but now plenty of women don't mind this new marriage market. Plenty of them like to spend time in less significant relationships, less serious ones, before deciding to get serious. It's certainly a more egalitarian world that we have today. It is a world that we collectively decided we wanted. But that world has made it more socially more difficult, not just personally more challenging, socially more difficult to reserve sex for marriage because of technology. We're wrestling over the unintended consequences. This is what it is, unintended consequences. The fallout, if you will, of the remarkable ability to prevent pregnancy. It really is a remarkable ability. Amazing thing. The world did not change overnight. Nothing of significance does. And that pill isn't the only price suppressor in the study of sex. Two other developments are making sex cheaper too, and in so doing making marriage rarer, later, and the road to it bumpier. Those two other technologies are pornography and online dating. Pornography scratches a very old itch in men's brains, the desire for sex, which historically was not scratched nearly so often or so easily or frequently as it can be today. We underestimate how this changes things. It is very difficult, though, to map how this affects the fall in marriage rates. There is simply more sexual stimulus today than, say, even as recently as 30 years ago. More marketing, more advertising, basically. And just like in the business world, advertising is meant to create demand, more demand. You probably hear enough about pornography these days, so I'm not going to say a great deal about it. All I'm going to tell you is what it does to the mating market. If a critical mass of emerging adult men consumes porn regularly, and by most estimates we're there now, it cannot help but shape these mating market dynamics. If it increasingly satisfies some of the male demand for intercourse, it reduces the value of intercourse, access to which women control. I'll say it again. If pornography increasingly satisfies some of the male demand for intercourse, it reduces the value of intercourse, the economic value of it, the value that men are willing to go to acquire it. It reduces that value, access to which she controls. It is not sex, but it's close enough, many men would confess. Since it gives men additional attractive sexual options, more supply to meet their demand, it by definition takes away some measure of price control away from women. And as a result, the cost of real sex goes down. Porn becomes easier to get to. Women feel pressure to be easier to get to as well. And women are increasingly accommodating to it. You might think they shouldn't. I empathize with that remark. And yet we often overlook another casualty of pornography and the human reaction to it. Relationships that fail to launch. Breaking off a relationship because of pornography use. Right? And it can be heavy, it can be light. Breaking off a relationship can be a rational, justifiable, and moral reaction to a problem. But such actions still contribute in ways we don't often note to the broader retreat from marriage. I recently observed an online dispute over the matter of men marrying and pornography. A crestfallen young woman discovered her boyfriend struggled with pornography. Never quite sure what struggling means. As a measurement guy, I want to know, what does that mean? Since it's a rather subjective assessment. This young woman elected to remain in her relationship, but she counseled other women to consider the path of least resistance. Leaving. Departing, she thought, was the best option. Wasn't the first time I've read about this. Not long before that, I was out at the Ruth Institute out in San Diego. Good people. Sat around a campfire with a couple dozen very enthusiastic young adults. In this case, I was listening to the women recount their list of relationship deal breakers. Porn was, of course, one of them, while the men kind of sat around sheepishly. I'm sympathetic to their concern. But I can also promise that widespread departures, given the numbers we have on pornography use, will only accelerate the flight from marriage in the church and is likely to backfire on women, as many things do in the domain of relationships. Women who would leave for pastures that well may not turn out to be greener. Again, women leave relationships either before or within marriage because they can in ways that they never could before. And they're voting with their feet. I would never dream of telling anybody, devoid of personal information about their situation, what they ought to do about that situation. However, I have no problem or qualms in declaring that collectively, such a categorical call to leave spells doom. Young adults are waiting longer and longer to marry already, and fewer are doing so. So we have the pill, we have porn, and now we have online dating. Okay, Catholics, we are against the pill, against porn, online dating. What are you going to do? Why pick on online dating? I'm not to hear it actually to declare it bad. It's not inherently good or bad. But humans, sneaky creatures that we are good at taking neutral things and steering them in suboptimal directions. The problem with online dating is, ironically, it's attraction. It's speed and efficiency. It's consonant with a hookup mentality, which likewise is about speed and efficiency. Basically, it enables women to endure the male-dominated marriage market more rapidly and with greater intensity. Online dating doesn't foster patience or waiting for anything. You can see signs of what we were meant for in the advertising for online dating sites. They target that part of the human heart that longs for connection and permanence. They boast of successful matches more than they do successful marriages. They talk about how long a couple they paired has been together, not how long they've been married. They speak of singles in the hopes that they wouldn't stay that way for long. And yet the success of the online dating world isn't all that impressive when compared to the hours, weeks, months, even years that many people spend navigating it. Even the Catholic and evangelical sites are not immune from the predictable problems that plague relationship markets in general, like I've talked about. Women are shocked at how rapidly the men they meet there expect sex in a budding relationship. Some adapt, some bail. Not a few men are subsequently surprised at how women presume sex comes with the territory of dating. This is not the fault of Catholic Match. It's the fault of an ill marriage market that they're trying to navigate. And as online dating ages, we're seeing the rise of more efficient forms, like Tinder. Swipe this way if he's cute, swipe that way if he's not. And remember that online dating sites admit they only make money when you are using the site. So your success in relationship means lost revenue for them. They are only half-heartedly interested in you actually finding love and marriage. In a pinch, they'd rather you not. And they actually admit this. They say, this is tough, right? Our business model is not comport with what we're trying to get for people. In the end, you see the very different marriage market we now inhabit. People are making trade-offs more than ever before. Our three technological developments I talked about demand trade-offs. Fewer and fewer people get exactly what they want on the timetable they prefer. And once a successful match is made, once a marriage is entered, all these forces just don't stop there. As I said earlier, women seem to bear more than average frustrations in seeking marriage. Men, on the other hand, this is something I've studied more recently, tend to lose power within marriage. I'm not saying they like marriage less than women. On average, they like marriage more than women. It's an interesting phenomenon. They're slower on the uptake, and they like it more when they're inside. Women, quicker to want in, quicker to want out. We actually see this in a more pure sense in lesbian relationships, which is the gender combination that breaks apart most readily. One reason for this is that most men who are marrying are pursuing, in some ways, a functional relationship. I'm not saying a working relationship. I'm saying a relationship that is functional in its orientation. Different people do different things. While many women who marry are probably more apt to be chasing a symbolic relationship, a capstone, something to be rather than something to do. I'm not saying all women, but I think men track towards the functional more than women do. Hence, tension can emerge over the very purpose of marriage. But the clear cultural winner, of course, is the symbolic capstone notion of marriage. So one problem is that expectations for marriage run high, probably too high. One 20th century Catholic observer lamented this human habit, which extends well beyond marital hopes to simple ones about work, health, material goods, vacations, what you're going to have for dinner tonight. He said, it happens with so many things in life. We inject them with poetry in our imaginations. We idealize them and come to believe they are the epitome of happiness and beauty. And then we have them in front of us. We see them just as they are, and our hearts sink to our boots. And that tends to bother women more than it bothers men, on average. One of the particular challenges men face inside marriage, and a reason that some men are reticent to jump in, concerns identity. Marriage long afforded, especially functional marriage, long afforded men a role, and with it a set of duties that was respected in a local status hierarchy. Modern marriage's ability to reinforce men's masculinity and their identity is, in a word, precarious. And when roles within marriage become less and less distinguishable and more interchangeable, men's roles become less male. Women had always had to be versatile in marriage. Men aren't crazy about being versatile in marriage, frankly. Hence, marriage itself is no longer predictably and discernibly male. It just isn't. Men have long been willing to work, sweat, bleed, even die in order to earn respect. Marriage offered that. It doesn't anymore, at least not widely and predictably so. We hear a good deal more about marital happiness, though, today. I suspect that happiness preference is emerging to fill the hole created when marriage no longer provided public affirmation of the identity of man as husband and father, woman as wife and mother. When those are not esteemed in such a way that you can count on them almost as a form of capital, when those aren't esteemed like that, well, marriage is going to have to generate something to merit its challenges. Happiness has become it. Hence, when well-meaning social observers, even conservatives, like Kay Heimowitz, a good person, when they poke fun at men's extended adolescence, challenge them to man up, it is failing to register. It falls flat. It's not going to work this time. The connection between marriage and masculinity is simply too precarious. And men sense that. Some hold about marriage that, quote, ultimately society is asking men to do something that is now going against their interests. And some men just don't want to do it. This is certainly the case legally, where men increasingly sense that their marital and parenting interests are not recognized. And can you believe that less than, I think, 150 years ago, women typically didn't receive custody rights when they left their husband, right? Children were a man's, right? Divorce rates were very low. Much has changed. I'm not suggesting that law is wrong, only that it matters. The Catholic Church rightly rejects being beholden to the state regarding marriage and divorce. But this does nothing to the fact that its parishioners are subject to the state in this regard. What the state decides when a man leaves when a woman leaves her husband or a man leaves his wife is authoritative. I did a thought experiment while I was preparing for this talk, and I wondered to myself, what would happen if the church extended its authority over the family lives of the faithful? So they didn't decide only annulments, but they also decided child support and custody arrangements. On one hand, I thought, I might trust it better to represent the importance of the family, of mothers and fathers, and their complementary roles and gifts in family life. On the other hand, I can't imagine it ever happening. I can't imagine Catholics allowing it. We poke fun at Protestants who read religious authority into family law court decisions. But Catholics aren't that much better. The state is increasingly, depressingly, citizens-only shared authority. The public square is nearly naked, as Father Newhouse warned. Many here would be prepared to defend the Church's teachings on marriage, divorce, and remarriage, but would you really be prepared to bend the knee to the Church on the 80% of other family matters that the law takes up and that the Church essentially ignores, or rather they deed it to the state? You probably have never given it any thought. The Catholic Church in cultural exile, which is what we're heading for, will probably be an impressive thing. But we have a long way to go before we are operating like Orthodox Judaism has, almost a separate set of institutions. So, something powerful is going on here. The culture has eroded not only simply because people have decided to think differently today about sexuality, relationships, and marriage, or because young adults have no more interest in chastity. Oh, they do. Things have changed because the relationship economy has witnessed a massive reorganization in the past 50 years. Women's career opportunities have flourished, and that is a good thing. But a key means by the manner in which people got there, contraception, has unintentionally created a social world in which people are increasingly reticent to marry, quick to have sex. Benefits of marriage largely less obvious, largely replaced by cohabitation. The end result of all this price suppression is that we have more sexually active young adult Catholics and evangelicals, I could give this talk everywhere, than ever before. It's not surprising. Sex is alluring. It will always be that way. Sex is the one thing in here that has not changed. It works like it's supposed to. It bonds. That's its nature. But the Church has to be called out of all this to be a peculiar people, in step with peaking fertility and sexual interest, the nature of things. Our young adults need to be encouraged to be about the business of discerning and pursuing their vocations. They're calling either to marriage or to singleness, whichever it is. And both, for unique reasons, are excellent things. And both ideally ought to be freely chosen. They need not rush it. I've actually come down off of my early marriage stuff of a few years ago. They need not rush it, but they ought to be discerning it. They need not have met their spouse yet, but they ought to be discerning whether they are called to be a spouse. And we have to take in mind that this is a social problem that involves us. It's not just that poor person's problem of finding a spouse. We cannot alter the structural realities that I talked about. They are here to stay, I suspect, barring cataclysm. What Christians ought to do then is to do what they do best. Be the church, anticipate some degree of exile, love one another. That's going to be really important in the future. Declare transcendence, mature, hold out hope to a world that's going to be increasingly desperate for love, real love. Practice self-sacrifice, grow in sanctity, marry or not, stay married if at all possible, bearing witness to the fidelity of Christ and His church. Make new people. Care for those who've been neglected. Everyone is called to motherhood spiritually or physically, to fatherhood physically or spiritually. It's part of the very meaning of our bodies. There's my little bit of theology of the body. It's part of our meaning of our bodies. A meaning that is not up for alteration. But it is, however, a brave new world that we are seeing, not far off from the one Huxley described about. So I'm going to stop there and we can break and take questions. Thank you.
We'll have a 10-minute break. If you want to ask a question, there are index cards right next to the picture of Our Lady. And then we